Hello, my name is Margaret Finley. I am the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Strategist here at the Society. In this studio this morning for a conversation, I have Tiffany Crosby, Chief Learning Officer here at the Society. And this morning we're going to be talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion from the perspective of how do we go beyond initiatives and really start to make it part of everyday business or just part of your culture. So Tiffany, before we get into our conversation, tell us a little bit about your role here at the Society and some things that you focus on.
So as the Chief Learning Officer, I really focus on all aspects of learning. So whether that is the more traditional aspects that individuals tend to think about, from the conferences and seminars and webcasts and online learning, to some things that individuals may not think about, including the events and town halls, and just thinking about what other learning we may want to bring through CPA Voice or through podcast or a whole variety of means in which we may engage with our members and really try and advance learning within the profession. And that includes diversity, equity, and inclusion. One of the things that I've been excited about in this role that I've been in now for at the Society about 6 years. And one of the things I've really been excited about is the ability to integrate diversity, equity, and inclusion into learning and really think about what that means from a talent development and talent management aspect, and how do we really start to incorporate that into everything.
Okay, awesome. And so as you think about diversity, equity, inclusion, and the state of our society, when I say that, the overall society and even the world around, what comes to mind for you as it relates to the current state of affairs around DE&I?
So when I think about DEI, I first start to think about where it was when I entered this profession. So where I flash back to that 92 time frame, and I know I'm giving my age a little bit, but that's okay. But I flash back to that time frame and think about when I joined the accounting firm that I had joined right out of college. And I was really the first Black female in that office in a client-serving role. And all of the scrutiny that went with that. And then I look at where we're at now, and we have certainly made some advances. I see a lot more staff and seniors and other levels entering both at firms as well as in industry and finance roles. At the same time, that at the top of the level, that partner group, that senior manager group, that manager group, and equivalent roles in industry actually doesn't look that different than it did when I started. All right, the numbers haven't moved that much in those higher level positions, and so that representation hasn't changed. So I'm excited for what has changed as far as the pipeline and the attraction of diverse talent into the profession, and we certainly have a way to go to that. We can always improve there. And yet I'm also concerned by the lack of movement as you progress up that from a career standpoint and what that representation looks like.
Okay, and I know you don't want to give away your age, but to give perspective, context around how many years ago that was and like where we are now. So a ballpark of?
That was 92. So when you look at that, that would be about 29 years ago or so. So 29 years representation at the highest levels haven't changed that much. Maybe a small 0.05% or something, but minuscule.
Okay. Thank you for that. And so again, we're going to be talking about, well, first let's describe, what do you think the difference is between DE&I initiatives and business imperative and making it a part of your business? How would you distinguish between the two?
So when I think about a DEI initiative, I think about something that more sits on the side. Someone does it, there's a program here or there, maybe that program occurs once a year, or maybe there's some type of quarterly meeting. People may go to it, it's often optional. sometimes it might be mandated, but many times it's optional. And if it fits on people's schedule, then they participate. Right?
Okay.
But if it doesn't fit, or there's a client conflict, or there's some other deadline, then it's one of those things that just gets set aside.
Okay.
If there's budgetary pressures, it gets set aside in order from that perspective. When I think of it as being a part of a business imperative, it really starts to change the way you do business. You start to think about it as far as who are you doing business with, who are your suppliers, and your customer base. What does that look like? How do you do hiring? How are you doing talent development? How are you doing job assignments and mentoring and coaching, and who's getting sponsored? And it just becomes something that you consider in all aspects, even your workspace and how it's laid out and how accommodating is it, how accessible is it. So it just becomes something that you factor into every major decision. I'm not going to say every single decision,
Okay.
but all the major decision and all your major processes that you undertake to do your business.
Okay. Good. And so, because we're going to be talking about how do we make DE&I a part of the culture, describe for me and our audience culture. How would you define culture? What does that mean in the workplace culture?
So I've studied culture a lot.
Okay.
Right? Because I like studying people. I like studying sociology, psychology, all these things. And you can get into all these complicated definitions of culture and all these long-winded and all these big words and all those things. But if we were to keep it simple, culture is simply the norms of how things get done in your company. It's really how people relate to one another. It's generally unwritten, right? The unwritten rules of how you navigate and how the business operates.
Okay. Awesome. And in thinking about that and thinking about how a company or organization can really focus on their overall DE&I strategy, right? And thinking about how to engage at every level of the organization. For example, I am a firm believer that culture starts at the top of the house, right? It's defined by the CEO, their direct reports, and then that cascades down throughout the organization. So what are your thoughts around how to have the conversation or integrate culture into the workplace or respective business?
Yeah. When I think about that, and I'm going to keep going back and comparing firms and comparing finance or industry, because they are very different in their structures
Okay.
and often in the hierarchies that are in place,
Okay.
and a lot of the oversight and governance, and therefore just all of those processes. So if I go to firms and I think about that, so often what you'll see is an initiative might start, or that DEI buy-in and culture may start at that partner principal level, and it may get cascaded down to senior managers, but where the challenge often is in that manager group.
Okay.
And that manager group is often the ones that they're out there day to day. They're leading the teams. They're making a lot of the decisions. They are really setting the day-to-day culture, right? So there may be this organizational culture that's the goal. That's what's in the vision. That's what's in the mission. That's what is guiding a lot of the framework. But the execution of that happens in the trenches.
Sure.
And so if we think of those that are out there leading the teams, often making the job assignments, writing performance reviews, all of those type of things, that's where it often becomes harder, because they're more dispersed.
Sure.
And you don't see what they're saying or doing day to day, but that's what the staff and seniors are experiencing. And when there's a disconnect between that and what is being said up here and what's being experienced here, that's often what creates a lot of that dissatisfaction and ultimately leads to the disengagement and perhaps even exiting before they reach that manager or senior manager level, because what they've heard and what they've experienced doesn't match.
Right.
If we go to the industry side, it often is more because they tend to serve the business, right? So you have this finance team, and this finance team has to partner with the different components of the business, be it operations and business development and the front line and all these things, and they're the business partner. And it's that same thing. So you may have it within finance, you may have a culture, but you also have cultures in these different teams that they're serving.
Right.
And how do those teams interact?
Right.
And what are they experiencing as they seek to try and serve those teams? And so you have complex cultural dynamics going on that you have to try and manage and make sure there's buy-in. Again, dispersed. And so how do you do that? So how do you get it to go from here to here, where you might have this core group, maybe there's 10 or 13 people here, but when you get down to here, you may be dealing with 50, 60, 70
Sure.
or more. And in larger organizations, hundreds, right?
Yes.
And so how do you get them to think and act in a way that's consistent with it? That's where the challenge is at.
So that's a good segue, Tiffany, into the next question. So when you think about strategy, share with us a little bit of your thoughts of how do you, one, bridge the gap between, there's a conversation at the top of the house, right? It has to cascade down through the organization, and sometimes the water gets a little muddy and there's this not so much good connection. What kind of strategy would you recommend in getting, I like to use the word, all hearts and minds in alignment?
Yes. This is where, and we've heard this phrase a lot, what gets measured gets done, what gets rewarded, some of those things. This is where that integration into goal setting,
Okay.
into coaching, into performance reviews, all of those things is so important. So when individuals are told that diversity, equity, and inclusion is important and that it's a business imperative, but they're really only measured on productivity and they're only measured on perhaps either client satisfaction, be it that whether that's an internal client or an external client, when those are the measures and metrics, but there aren't those people metrics and those culture metrics that they're also being held accountable for that are of equal importance in that process, then it becomes harder to really get a behavior change.
Sure.
Right.
Right.
Now, if you have those goals, you have to provide the performance support in order to help people with those behaviors. So you need to make sure that they have access to the training that they need, that they have access to the mentoring and the coaching, and that you're creating those safe environments where they can ask questions and not feel like they're going to be unduly penalized for them, right? That they're not going to have their career set back because there was something that they just didn't know, right? We don't know what we don't know.
Right.
We're all on a journey, and there is no one who has mastered every culture, every cultural nuance, that knows just the right thing to say to each person regardless of their background. That's just not a realistic expectation.
Sure.
We should all be growing, and so how do we make sure that they have that environment that encourages that growth, but also holds them accountable for taking the actions that lead to growth?
Right. Right. And I think you and I have had conversations around leaders getting comfortable with being uncomfortable,
Yes.
right? So there's a certain level of, to your point, not knowing what you don't know, and sometimes I think our work around DE&I can make people uncomfortable, right?
Yes.
And as I think about our clients that we engage with, one of the things I try to focus on to say is that this is a no judgment zone, right?
Right.
My role here is to help you advance your strategy around DE&I. So from that perspective, can you talk about how do you get leaders comfortable with being uncomfortable? And what I mean by that is, having real dialogue, I like to say essential conversations around DE&I, what we're dealing with, right, and where we want to go. How do you, or do you find that you have to get people comfortable?
You do, absolutely. And I have had to get people comfortable. I find for me the easiest way to get people comfortable is to be vulnerable myself, right? And to
Okay.
be transparent and to share some of my own failures, some of my own lessons learned, because I think that there can be this perception that I have it all together, that I figured it all out, that I mastered it, that I don't make any mistakes. And I have shared in different trainings, different things that I've done. I've shared things that were ahas for me, like, oh, I didn't know that. I made this comment to someone and it never dawned on me that it could be perceived in this way or taken this way. I was just clueless, or I didn't know certain aspects. So, or I share situations where I knew that I was going into something that I really didn't have a background in, right? There was a time where I worked a lot during my Ernst & Young days where I worked a lot with Japanese business clients.
Okay.
And I had no background in that. And so I went through some etiquette classes, both business etiquette, and then when it came to having to do lunch or dinner, like there are very specific ways that you need to engage that I had to consider, not just from a business, like here's how business is traditionally done from more of a Japanese culture, but also understanding some of the gender dynamics,
Okay.
right? Because there are some gender nuance to how you would interact across cultures. And I've had to do the same thing when it comes to interacting with some of my Muslim business associates or friends, with Jewish, you name it, right? And within each of those, I've had to have some courage to ask questions. If I see something going on and I just don't understand and I don't know whether it's important or not, or what's the significance, then I ask about it. I remember when I really had to try and get a better understanding of how Jewish holidays are observed,
Okay.
right? Because they follow a different schedule. The sundown, the sundown aspect, and understanding that it really starts kind of that day before, and some of those things, and what does it mean, and which ones are is work prohibited versus work might be allowed, and how do we schedule things around that, and all of those things. Those are things that you don't just naturally know.
Right.
You have to ask questions and you have to do some research, but you have to make yourself vulnerable to do that.
Right.
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 And you have to actually acknowledge that you don't know. Right. And there's some humility that comes with that,
Right.
of saying, I don't know. And you can sometimes risk offending someone by asking the question, but I would rather risk offending them because I asked a question out of genuine curiosity than offending them because I actually did something that really discounted who they were and what was important to them.
Right. This is truly journey work, right? This is not a sprint. It is truly a marathon, and you're not always going to get it right, right? We got to give that certain level of grace to people to make mistakes and to learn from their mistakes and move on. So as we think about, when you said something a little earlier around what gets measured gets done, right? And I think you and I have read so many research and studies and the data that talks about specifically around the accounting profession and the lack of moving the needle, so to speak, right? And representation across the accounting profession. From reading all of that data, what it says in your experience, because you've been in the accounting profession for a while, what do you think is getting in the way of advancing diversity, equity, inclusion across the accounting profession? Do you think it's more lack of diversity, so representation, or equal opportunity, or this conversation around not feeling like you belong? And we've had those conversations, and I believe it was Howard University that shared a report with us back in 2019, and it talked about the number one reasons that people of color leave the accounting profession is not that they're not smart, not that they don't enjoy the work, but it's because of this lack of belonging, going into an environment, not feeling I can bring my full and authentic self. So can you talk with us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so there were multiple things in
Sorry,
there.
I did. I just peppered you with that.
And but when I think about everything that we've been reading, that I've been studying, even some of the conversations that I have had, and why that representation seems so hard to move, there's a few comments that stick out to me from all of both the reading and the conversations with individuals who have advanced and left, or who have chosen just different careers. And one of the things that really stands out is that there starts to be this exhaustion,
Okay.
right? Over time, of microaggressions that build up, or of having to prove themselves over and over and over again, or having this assumption that they're in this role where they got this promotion not because of their resume and because of what they've accomplished and because of their competence and their capability, but because they fit a certain demographic, because they're a black female, or they're an Asian female, or Latino, or whatever that demographic is. And you can look at their resume, and they have all of this community involvement, all of these times where they've led projects successfully, and all of these other things, and it's an impressive resume by any measure. And yet there is still an assumption by many that they are there simply because they check a box, and that they've had an easier road to get there, and they get tired of defending themselves. So that's one of the challenges. I think another challenge is that, as one of the individuals put it, is that we tend to reward for intention more than outcome. Right. And so we had this event, and so we feel good about that. We did this, we set up an employee resource group, so check the box, we did good, all right. But what's been the outcome? Has that resulted in actually higher retention levels? Has it resulted in additional promotions? Has it resulted in more diversity in the boardroom? What has actually been the outcome? So there is this pat on the back for good intention, without necessarily saying, but what's been the outcome?
Right.
Have we actually accomplished anything? And if we haven't, what's really getting in the way now? So how do we move that? How do we actually have some of those more difficult things of saying, yeah, we brought all of these candidates in. We have this diverse recruiting slate, but it's still the same individuals that get the job offer. So, yeah, we're getting this diversity on paper for the interview process, but those who are advancing through the process still look the same. So what's going on?
Right. And even when they advance and they are ultimately selected and chosen, I want to talk a little bit more about what can leaders and managers do to make those people, the people of color, I would say, feel more welcome in the environment and this sense of belonging.
And that's where this idea of sponsorship comes along, and allyship, but probably even more so sponsorship.
Okay.
Right? Because we have focused a lot on mentoring, and mentoring really says, I'm going to tell you the experiences that I've had in order to get to where I'm at, and what I believe you need to do in order to get there, right? So it's all about how do you kind of take ownership, and what do you need perhaps to fix about yourself, or to just continue to work on, or some of those things. Not always, right? Some of it can be just positive things, but sponsorship says, how am I going to use my network, my access, my success to open doors for you? Right? When there's a challenging assignment that comes along, who do you normally think of to fill those assignments? Is it the same people, and how diverse are they? Right.
Right.
And when you, so who are you speaking up for behind closed doors?
Sure.
And often that begins by getting to know people, right? Because you're not going to sponsor some random person that you don't have a relationship with, that you've only heard about. Generally, sponsorship happens because you've developed some type of relationship. You've gone to lunch, you've served together, you've done other types of things where you've gotten comfortable with their just competence and their leadership or some of those other things, and you're like, this is a person who I can put my equity, my political capital, my reputation, all of those things, I can extend it for them. And so it really starts then by being very intentional about who you're developing those type of relationships with. Who are you having lunch with? Who are you serving with? Who are you just having those social networks with? And if they all look like you, that's probably who you're sponsoring too.
Right, right. And so with that notion, I think you and I have talked about this, and for people of color, they often feel like they're over-mentored and under-sponsored.
Correct.
So I think in 3 different levels. I think about mentoring first, then coaching, and then sponsorship. What is your perspective on the definition or the difference between the 3? So we'll start with, what does, you kind of talked about it, so you don't have to spend that much time on it. What does it mean to be a mentor? And then what does it mean to be a coach? And then you kind of finished up with what a sponsor does.
Yeah.
But that probably you want to focus on, what does a coach do? So that's the middle level.
Yeah. So a coach often helps individuals just process and think through their experiences. They may challenge them to brighten that thinking a little bit.
Okay.
So coaches often ask probing questions, whereas mentors generally bring their expertise in a very specific area to the table. So perhaps you have a mindset that you want to become CFO, or you want to become a partner. Well, generally, you're going to, from a mentorship, you're going to be mentored by someone who's already traveled that path, because they're using their expertise to help guide you to say, here are some of the experiences you need, the opportunities you need, some of the ways you need to develop yourself. Whereas a coach really doesn't need to have experience in your particular field or even in your desired career path. What they really need to be able to do is to listen and be able to probe and be able to help you through a path of discovery.
Sure.
And really challenge you and open up that perspective. Whereas a sponsor needs to have a network, and they need to have access, right? They need to be operating in a way where they already have developed that resume, and so they're able to pick up the phone and open a door for you, right? And it may not, again, it may not necessarily be in your organization. Often is, if that's where your goals are at. But if your goals are outside of that, then you probably need a sponsor that is outside of that.
Right. So as we continue to talk about moving away from initiatives and more making DE&I a part of your culture, what comes to mind for you when you think about what happened last year with George Floyd? So May of last year, we had this horrific incident happen, and per that, companies, firms, and organizations have come out with a mission statement, or a statement around what happened, right? Committed. A lot of companies and organizations have given millions of dollars, right? And some are pledging billions of dollars to focus on racial and social justice. So as we think about that, and here at the Society, we've made a commitment that you may want to talk about as well. But how do we sense that 1 year later? Let me start with this question. What do you think has changed with companies and organizations outside looking in from a culture perspective as a result of the George Floyd situation?
I I really do believe that that situation was a wake-up call.
Okay.
I think we had moved into a place of complacency.
Okay.
We felt comfortable with what was going on from a DE&I space, right? Because there have been some initiatives underway, 20 years, 25 years, right? And there's been all these good intentions and conversations, and I think that that became a impossible to ignore
Okay.
a wake up call that we still have some very fundamental issues, systemic issues that run deep in our society, and that we have really tackled the easy things. We've made the easy changes, but we haven't done the hard things because they're hard and they require change and they don't change overnight. And these are the things that really require often lots of different teams, perhaps even organizations working together. So this isn't even necessarily something that just one company can change. That's why I think it's so critical as an accounting profession that we're having those discussions beyond just our four walls to say, how do we come together to work on this? Because there are some systems that have been built up through the practice just over time, right? And they become industry practice and standard. But we have to take a step back and say, how do we change that? Well, something that is standard across an industry isn't going to be changed by one organization.
Right.
It has to be changed by a collective group coming together and committing to that.
Right.
That is part of what I see has changed, though, is that not just the realization that we have to work together on this, but the willingness. Right? And I've seen more organizations opening up, being far more transparent about what's going on within their four walls, being transparent with other organizations, and coming together and saying, all right, I'm going to be transparent so that we can work together and say, how do we move forward collectively versus our individual efforts? We may be competitors, right? And we may be in that same competitive marketplace, and we're going to continue to be competitors when it comes to some of our business models and revenue generation. But this is an issue that transcends that. So how do we work together on this particular issue? And that to me has been a significant change. And I think because of that, we're seeing things starting to move that hasn't moved before. That just hasn't changed because of that collective effort.
Can you give an example? So one, you talked about things being hard. Can you give us some example of what's hard, and what do you believe has not moved as swiftly as it should or could?
So one of the things that's hard, and this is something with, I'm going to use firms initially, and then I'll also use industry, but one of the things that's hard is we do have a model in firms that is more of a pyramid or a model, a funnel, right?
Okay.
And so you, by default, have more staff, more seniors, or more staff, and then fewer seniors, then fewer managers, fewer partners, etc. That's how the model works. And so there is this element of natural attrition that is expected, right? And if it doesn't happen, you must have to force it to happen because there's only so many spots to continue to move up. And some of that is being challenged, but because of that, there's also been this emphasis on often things that tend to be more quantifiable data, and making some of those, so GPAs and some of those type of things often have been in those criteria for even getting in at that entry level. But what has really started to shift and change as firms have come together, and just as we've been talking about this, is recognition that individuals there's often stories behind some of that data. So let's just take GPA.
Okay.
The assumption often has been if someone has a 4.0 GPA, they're more qualified perhaps than someone that has a 3.2.
Okay.
Right. But in reality, if that person who has a 3.2 was working full-time or part-time, they were juggling home responsibilities, and all of these other things that may be a component of their story. Whereas someone who had the 4.0 didn't have to do any of that, so they were able to focus 100% on their schoolwork. Well, that 3.2 may actually be a better indicator because of that full story.
Yes.
Is a better indicator of success than the GPA alone.
Okay.
Right? Because they've had to learn how to balance, do time management, organizational skills, project management, all of these other things. That is a component of success in our profession, and it doesn't just come through if you focus solely on this one metric. And I think but changing those processes, that means you have to change the screening tools, and you have to change how people do interviews and how people do at that initial perhaps assessment when they're out there doing recruiting on campuses. You might even have to change what campuses you go to, because some of those individuals, because of their GPA, may have gotten into schools that perhaps isn't traditionally where you recruit. And so all of a sudden, just making that recognition causes you to have to change all of these other things.
Sure. Okay. Good. And continuing on with that, when I think about, you and I have often talked about less words and more action. So how do we begin to move to action? So I'll go back to some of the assessments, and well, let me start first with a culture and inclusion assessment, and that's something that we've done here at the Society. That's something that we're doing with our clients that we consult with. Do you think a culture, and I hope you say yes, a culture and inclusion assessment is important in environments, and talk a little bit about what that means and what you can find out by having one of those?
So, because so much rests on culture, right? And so often we have an assumption of what our culture is.
Right.
But we actually have never validated that, or we think because we have this in our mission statement, or we have it in our vision, and we have a code of conduct that encaptures it, that's what people are actually experiencing. And because there can be a disconnect between what the desired culture and the espoused culture and what's actually being experienced, that's one of the reasons I think culture assessment is so important. And I think that culture assessment, especially if you look at each of those different components like hiring, career development, policies and procedures, the actual culture, right? When you look at those different areas, it starts to give you a sense of what are people actually experiencing versus what you think they're experiencing.
Right.
And if done well, right? And if individuals are comfortable doing it, so there does have to be sufficient safety that they feel like they're not going to be retaliated against, for being honest, it can point you to some of those areas where you may want to have more conversations or consider why are we only rating this, right? In this particular area, what's actually going on. So it can get to some of those inclusion and belonging issues. And it can get to some of those areas, going back to the previous question, that may be those difficult areas where we're saying, okay, we thought we had this inclusive culture, but we're being rated much lower than we thought we were. So what's actually going on? Where is that disconnect? What is that hard work we might need to do? Because we've done the training, we've done unconscious bias training, we have it in our policies, we do this code, we're reinforcing it, but yet what people are experiencing day to day hasn't changed. And that might point you to some of those hard areas, like some of the day-to-day management activities or
Sure.
the microaggressions or other things that are mindset changes and behavioral changes that have to happen,
Sure.
right? And that are harder.
Right. And even in thinking about taking that culture and inclusion assessment, and you kind of used the word a little earlier around safety, right? And so this terminology around psychological safety,
Yes.
right? And how do we have conversations even before your team engages in that assessment, that perhaps a best practice is to talk about psychological safety and what it is and why it's important, right, to have prior to taking an assessment, so people to feel like they can answer honestly on the assessment. So how would you describe psychological safety and the importance of it as part of building the culture?
Right. So psychological safety really means that you can be honest and not have it held against you, right? And the challenge with that is that often is hard to build and easy to lose, right? It's kind of, I equate it to trust, because trust is a part of psychological
Yes.
safety. And I know when we do the ethics training, I often talk about trust and say, if you think back to when your trust was broken, right, and in a broken trust, how long did it take that person to restore trust with you? And generally people say a long time, sometimes never, right?
Right.
Because that broken trust can be hard to restore. Well, psychological safety can be like that within a culture. If you have an environment where people have spoken up and they've been retaliated against, they've been fired, or they've had a promotion withheld, or other things that has happened, you can say this is a safe environment all you want, but your actions have indicated otherwise.
Right.
And so it may take a while to restore that, and it may seem like a lot of time and intention and effort is going into it, and it's not moving. But that's how it is with broken trust, right?
Right.
It takes a lot of intention to restore that trust. And so psychological safety is one of those things that is worth paying attention to, because if you don't have that, all of the things we're talking about becomes very difficult to do. Having those difficult conversations, being able to ask those questions that help you grow from a DEI standpoint, all of those other things depends on having that psychological safety. Even being able to do a cultural assessment that shows you what your true culture is.
Right.
Right? And all of those things, it all hinges on that. And so if you have an environment where that is missing, you're going to have to do the hard work of trying to reestablish that before you're going to be able to create some of the environments necessary to uncover the hard issues that you need to address.
Right. And I think you said it a little earlier about leadership may have a perspective or thought around what the culture is, and then you take this assessment, right, and then you get something different, and it's like, oh, I didn't know that, right? And I think about how can we ensure that what you think the culture is what it is, right? And so when you think about your managers, engaging them, training them, getting them comfortable with uncomfortable conversations, and then them having conversations with their respective team, what do you think can be done as an action item that makes the atmosphere safe? Is that a training? Is it one-on-one conversation between the managers and leader? Like, what would your recommendations be to ensure that there is psychological safety in the culture?
I think this is one, and you mentioned this before, right? It has to start at the top.
Yes.
So I think this is one where they need to see the leadership being vulnerable and open and doing so safely. So if the leaders are able to be open with the executives, and they they're able to see that and see that, oh, they have honest conversations, they ask difficult questions, and that is actually encouraged, and then those leaders start to do the same with their direct reports, right? It has to cascade, because it is really unfair to think that a staff or a new finance person is going to be able to come in and just ask some of these questions if they don't see those that have been there in that environment for 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, engaging in that way.
Sure.
Because the perception is then going to be, oh, that isn't accepted. You don't question authority. You don't question the executives, right? And so they have to see that modeled, not just on occasion, but in team meetings, in staff meetings, or town halls, like forums, whatever name people want to use for how they engage internally.
Sure.
And those communities, they have to see those type of conversations occurring in project team meetings, etc., where there is this back and forth dialogue on just everyday decisions, right? Mm-hmm. It's not just a DEI thing, right? If we think that we're going to have more safety on a DEI conversation than we have on a conversation about a business model or strategy, we're fooling ourselves, right? Because that is your culture. Your culture is your culture, and
Right.
and so if they don't see, if someone is saying, we want to do this new product, and they're not seeing this robust conversation occurring and it being questioned and a positive response to those questions, why would we expect there to be a robust conversation around DE&I?
Right.
Right.
And even when you think about accountability, so let's say there's a situation where you shared openly, right? And then 3 months later or what have you, there's been retaliation. So when you think about accountability, being true to what we say, right, that there would be, this is a safe space in the situation. I've heard some situations that people have felt like, well, no, I spoke my mind and I didn't get the promotion, or, I don't feel part of the group anymore because people don't want to talk to me. How do you deal with that? Like, how can an employee that is experiencing that, what would you recommend they do if that happens to them?
And so there's a couple of things that I always try and think of. First is, we've got to make sure when we're sharing, right? And so I'm always asking, okay, that action that happened where you feel excluded, is that reality? Is that perception, right?
Okay.
And if it's reality, why is that? That's where, as a leader, you have to have the courage then to go to those that have started to pull away and say, hey, this isn't our culture, right? But it could also be perception. So I will use an example, and this is where the challenge is at. Let's say the person who spoke up truly did have a performance issue, but that performance issue hadn't been shared before, hadn't been communicated, and now when they spoke up and now they get their review, their perception is that they're being retaliated against. When what truly has happened is there was a breakdown in the performance review process in general, where they weren't getting timely feedback, they weren't getting coaching, all those things. So when you start having some of these conversations, if you have a general breakdown in your process, if you don't have good processes, then yes, you can end up having issues of perception, because some of the feedback that should have happened didn't happen. So now you have this person thinking they're being retaliated against when they're actually being shared feedback that is legitimate, but should have been shared before.
Sure.
Right.
Sure.
Now, if that's not the case, if it truly is retaliation, that's where the leaders have to step up and say, whoever is at that this is where those difficult things have to happen, where the leaders have to step in and say, no, this is not our culture, this is not acceptable, we do not retaliate, and they have to be willing to then do that difficult thing to reinforce that that action was not acceptable, whatever that needs to look like in their environment, and
Okay.
acknowledge it. It's like, no, this was retaliatory, and that's not our environment.
So Tiffany, thank you for your time today. This has definitely been a very, I call it compelling and engaging conversation. So is there any final thoughts you want to share with the audience as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how we really move away from activities and initiatives and really start to make DE&I a part of business imperative and just everyday business that we do? What are your final thoughts here?
Now, I think it's important that we ask the why, not the why are we doing DE and I, but the why as it relates to why do we want this inclusive culture? Like, what does it mean? What does that look like? How are we going to measure it, right? And really get crystal clear on those outcomes, because only then can we sit there and say, does this activity still make sense? So when I think about the why, it's more the why are we doing this particular task?
Okay.
Why are we doing this particular activity? What is it we're trying to accomplish, and how have we accomplished that? And if not, let's change it, right? Someone has always said, and I don't even know who first said this, but the definition of insanity is to continue to do the same things expecting a different outcome.
Right.
So we've done this for 25 years and it hasn't moved. So why are we going to keep doing it? Why are we just going to throw more money and more effort at something that hasn't changed?
Yes.
What are we going to do differently?
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. It's been a pleasure to have this conversation with you. And hopefully you all have enjoyed our conversation. If you want more information around what we're doing around diversity, equity, inclusion here at the Society, please feel free to go check out our website. We offer a plethora of services around DE&I. We have a culture and inclusion assessment that we can engage you in. And then we also have courses and training that we offer, and then as well as consulting. I engage our companies and firms in. So again, thank you for joining us, and we hope that you enjoyed the conversation. Take care.